I signed the papers they placed in front of me, and my daughter-in-law smiled like she had just erased me from my own life. The conference room on the 22nd floor of Bradley and Hunt Law offices smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh coffee, the kind of place designed to make people feel small if they didn't belong there. Vanessa Whitmore certainly looked like she belonged. She sat straight in her chair with the calm confidence of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided, her manicured fingers resting lightly on a leather folder that held the documents she and my son had spent weeks preparing. Across from her, Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, pretending to study the skyline beyond the tall glass windows. He had always hated conflict, even as a boy. When something uncomfortable happened, he would stare somewhere else and hope the moment passed quickly. At 38 years old, that habit had not changed much. I folded my hands neatly in my lap and waited while the attorney organized the papers on the table. Thomas Bradley was a tall man in his late 50s with silver hair and the kind of careful voice lawyers use when every word matters. He glanced over the pages once more before sliding them toward me. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently, "these are the documents transferring administrative control of Whitmore Holdings and several associated properties." Vanessa leaned forward slightly, almost eager. "It's just a formality," she said, her voice warm in that practiced way that never quite reached her eyes. "The company is too complicated for one person to manage, Margaret. Daniel and I can handle everything for you." I nodded slowly as if considering her words for the first time. Outside the window, traffic crawled along the streets of downtown Chicago, tiny cars gliding between the tall shadows of buildings. My late husband Edward had loved this view. Years ago, when Whitmore Holdings had its first small office 3 blocks from here, he would take me to lunch nearby and point toward the skyline like a proud child. "One day," he used to say, "our name will mean something in this city." It eventually did. But Edward was gone now. 2 winters had passed since the heart attack that took him quietly in our kitchen one snowy morning. The house had felt impossibly silent after that. For a long time I believed grief was the heaviest feeling a person could carry. I was wrong. Betrayal weighed far more. "You only need to sign on the highlighted lines," Bradley explained, tapping the pages gently with a pen. I adjusted my glasses and leaned forward. The letters blurred slightly for a moment before settling into focus. Legal language had a way of making simple things look complicated. But the meaning was clear enough: management authority, property decisions, financial control. All of it would pass to Daniel and Vanessa. I heard Vanessa exhale quietly, almost like someone waiting for the final note in a song. I could imagine what she was thinking. After months of careful persuasion, after endless conversations about my retirement and the burden of responsibility, this was the moment everything would finally belong to them. Daniel finally spoke, his voice cautious. "Mom, you don't have to worry about anything after this. Vanessa and I will make sure you're comfortable. Maybe even look into one of those senior communities near the lake. They're really nice." I looked at him then, really looked, noticing the faint lines around his eyes and the nervous way his fingers tapped the edge of the table. When he was 8 years old, he used to build little wooden boats with his father in our garage. Edward would sand the edges smooth, while Daniel painted the hulls bright blue or red. Those boats still sat somewhere in the attic of our old house in Evanston. For a brief second I wondered if Daniel remembered them. Vanessa slid a fountain pen toward me. "Whenever you're ready," she said softly. The room fell quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. I picked up the pen. My hand was steady. Age had slowed many things in my life, but it had not taken away my ability to make decisions. I signed the first page, then the second, then the third. Each signature flowed across the paper with the familiar curve of my name, Margaret Whitmore. Across the table, Vanessa's smile grew wider with every page. Daniel looked relieved, almost grateful that the moment seemed to be passing peacefully. When the last signature dried, I set the pen down carefully and folded my hands again. Vanessa let out a small breath of satisfaction. "See," she said lightly, "that wasn't so hard." Bradley gathered the documents and stacked them neatly. For a moment he didn't say anything, simply scanning the pages with a thoughtful expression. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxed now, like someone who had just finished closing a very profitable deal. She reached for Daniel's hand beneath the table and squeezed it gently. I noticed the gesture, but said nothing. The silence in the room stretched a little longer than expected. Bradley's eyes moved across the signatures once more before he placed the pen down beside the folder. He did not immediately close it. Instead, he paused. Something about that pause made the air in the room feel different, as if a quiet shift had taken place that only he seemed to notice. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "Is there anything else?" she asked. Bradley looked at the documents again, then slowly lifted his gaze toward the other folder sitting beside his briefcase. It was a slim folder, darker than the rest, and until that moment no one had mentioned it. Daniel followed his gaze with mild curiosity. I remained perfectly still. Bradley opened the folder with careful fingers and scanned the first page inside. His expression changed slightly, though it was subtle enough that most people might not have noticed. But after 68 years of watching people closely, I noticed. Vanessa's smile flickered for the briefest second. "Mr. Bradley," she said. The attorney finally looked up from the papers. His eyes moved from Vanessa to Daniel, and then slowly, deliberately, to me. The room seemed to grow quieter with each passing second. And then he spoke my name. Thomas Bradley looked directly at me when he said my name, and the sound of it in that quiet conference room made Vanessa's smile freeze halfway across her face. For a moment no one moved. Outside the glass walls of the office, the city of Chicago continued its ordinary afternoon rhythm. Cars rolled through intersections. People crossed sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases. But inside that room, everything felt strangely suspended, as if time itself had decided to pause and watch what would happen next. Bradley adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the dark folder he had just opened. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully, "before we finalize the documents you signed, there is another matter that must be addressed." Vanessa's fingers tightened slightly on the leather folder in front of her. The movement was small, but I noticed it immediately. She had always believed she could read a room better than anyone else. Today the room was beginning to speak a language she did not understand. Daniel shifted in his chair and cleared his throat softly. "What kind of matter?" he asked. Bradley did not answer immediately. Instead, he lifted a sheet of paper from the folder and studied it again, as though confirming something he had already read several times. The afternoon sunlight coming through the windows reflected across the polished conference table, and the light fell directly over the signature at the bottom of that page. My late husband's handwriting had always been precise. Edward Whitmore believed that details mattered, even small ones, especially small ones. 2 days ago, Bradley continued slowly, our office received a request to review the estate structure connected to Whitmore Holdings. That request was filed under your name, Mrs. Whitmore. Vanessa blinked once. Daniel looked confused. I simply sat with my hands folded neatly in my lap. The memory of that request felt very recent. It had happened early Monday morning while the city was still waking up. I had been sitting at the small breakfast table in my kitchen with a cup of black coffee and a yellow legal pad that once belonged to Edward. The house was quiet in the way only an old house can be quiet. The refrigerator hummed softly. The clock on the wall ticked with patient rhythm. Outside, a delivery truck rolled slowly past the curb. I had been staring at Edward's handwriting on the legal pad for several minutes before I picked up the telephone. His words were still there from years ago. A single sentence written during one of his many late nights working through company documents. Always verify who truly holds the key. Edward liked to leave reminders like that. He believed life was easier when you treated problems like puzzles instead of disasters. That morning I called a man named Robert Hale. Robert had worked as Whitmore Holdings senior accountant for more than 15 years before retiring to a small house outside Milwaukee. Edward trusted him more than almost anyone. When Robert answered the telephone, he sounded surprised to hear my voice. "Margaret," he said slowly, "it has been a long time." I explained the situation carefully, describing the documents Daniel and Vanessa had asked me to sign and the meeting scheduled at Bradley and Hunt. Robert listened without interrupting. When I finished, the line stayed quiet for several seconds. Then Robert gave a soft laugh. Not the kind people make when something is funny, but the kind that comes when someone recognizes a mistake before anyone else does. "Margaret," he finally said, "did Edward ever show you the original trust structure?" I told him he had mentioned it once many years ago, but never in detail. Robert let out a slow breath. "That does not surprise me. Edward believed in preparing safety nets. He created a master trust 20 years ago when the company expanded beyond Illinois. The documents were filed with 3 different legal offices. One copy remained with his attorney. One stayed with the company accountants, and the controlling authority was attached to a single name. I remember leaning forward slightly at the table. Which name? Robert chuckled again, softer this time. Yours, Margaret. The memory of that conversation still felt vivid as I sat in the conference room 2 days later. Bradley's voice pulled me back to the present. The document here confirms that Whitmore Holdings and all related assets were placed under a master trust in 2003, he explained. The controlling authority was designated at the time of filing. Vanessa leaned forward abruptly. I have never heard anything about a trust, she said sharply. Bradley nodded calmly. That is understandable. The trust documentation was never amended after its creation. Daniel frowned slightly. So what does that mean, he asked. Bradley turned the page slowly and placed it flat on the table. The paper slid across the polished surface until it rested directly between the three of us. It means, Bradley said, that the company, the properties, and the financial control structures connected to Whitmore Holdings are not transferred through the documents you signed today. Vanessa's expression hardened. That is not possible, she said. Bradley did not raise his voice. He simply pointed to the signature at the bottom of the page. Edward Whitmore's name stood there in careful blue ink. Beneath it was another line. My line. Signed 20 years earlier on a quiet afternoon I had almost forgotten. Bradley looked at Daniel and Vanessa with professional patience. The controlling beneficiary of the Whitmore Master Trust, he said, is Margaret Whitmore. The room fell silent again. Vanessa's confident smile had completely disappeared now, replaced by something far less certain. Daniel stared down at the paper as if trying to translate a language he had never studied. I folded my hands again and waited, remembering another thing Edward once told me during one of our long walks along Lake Michigan years ago. Margaret, he had said, people only rush when they think they have already won. In the quiet conference room high above the streets of Chicago, it was becoming very clear that someone had rushed far too soon. Daniel Whitmore continued staring at the paper on the conference table as if the words printed across it might rearrange themselves into something easier to understand. For several long seconds no one spoke. The sunlight from the tall windows stretched across the polished wood surface and rested directly on Edward Whitmore's signature, the careful blue ink line that had been written 2 decades earlier. Vanessa was the first person to break the silence. She leaned forward slowly, her posture rigid, her voice controlled but noticeably sharper than before. There must be some misunderstanding, she said. Daniel and I have reviewed the company documents many times. The ownership structure changed after Edward passed away. Thomas Bradley did not react with surprise. Attorneys who worked with corporate trusts were used to moments like this, moments when someone discovered that paperwork did not always say what they expected it to say. He folded his hands calmly on the table. The operational management structure changed, Bradley said patiently. But the controlling trust authority did not. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly. Daniel finally looked up from the paper and glanced at me, his expression uncertain, almost searching. Mom, he said carefully, did you know about this? I did not answer immediately. Instead, I allowed the quiet to settle again over the room. Silence can be very useful when people are beginning to realize something important. Edward understood that better than anyone. My mind drifted briefly to another afternoon many years ago when Whitmore Holdings was still a modest construction firm operating out of a converted warehouse near the Chicago River. Edward had been sitting at his desk with stacks of legal documents spread around him while I brought him a sandwich and a cup of coffee. He had looked up at me with the thoughtful expression he always wore when he was building something complicated in his mind. Margaret, he said that day, companies grow quickly when things go well. But people change just as quickly when money becomes involved. That is why you build a structure that can survive both. I remember asking him what he meant. Edward smiled and tapped the folder in front of him. Trust structures, he explained. Not the emotional kind. The legal kind. Back in the conference room, Bradley slid the paper slightly closer to Daniel. Your father filed the Whitmore Master Trust in 2003, he said. It covers the primary company assets, the Evanston property, the Michigan Lake property, and several investment accounts connected to Whitmore Holdings. Vanessa's jaw tightened. That property was transferred after the estate settlement, she said quickly. Bradley shook his head once. The operational authority can change through estate filings. But the controlling trust cannot be transferred without the authorization of the named beneficiary. He paused for a moment before finishing the sentence. That beneficiary is Margaret Whitmore. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair. The movement looked less like relaxation and more like someone trying to steady themselves. His gaze shifted from the paper to me again. "Mom," he said quietly, "why did you not say anything?" I looked at my son and felt the strange mixture of sadness and calm that had been sitting quietly in my chest for the past 2 days. The answer was simple, but simple answers sometimes take time to reach. "You did not ask," I said. Vanessa let out a short breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "That is ridiculous," she said. "Margaret, you signed documents transferring authority to us. You just signed them 10 minutes ago." Bradley lifted the signed packet gently and tapped the pages together so their edges aligned. "Those documents authorize administrative responsibilities," he explained. "They allow Daniel and Vanessa to manage daily company operations if Margaret Whitmore chooses to permit it. But they do not transfer ownership or final authority." Vanessa stared at him. "So what exactly did she sign?" Bradley looked at the final page again before answering. "She signed permission for you to assist with operational decisions under her supervision." The words hung in the air for a moment before Daniel slowly exhaled. Vanessa's face changed in a way that was difficult to describe. The confidence that had filled her expression earlier that afternoon had completely disappeared. In its place was something far more cautious. "That is not what we discussed," she said carefully. Bradley closed the folder containing the signed pages and placed it beside the darker folder holding the trust documents. "What you discussed and what the documents legally accomplish are two different matters," he replied. The quiet returned once again. Outside the window, a small tour boat moved slowly along the Chicago River far below, leaving a thin trail of ripples behind it. Daniel rubbed his forehead and stared down at the table. I could see the moment he began remembering certain conversations from the past 2 years. Conversations about selling properties. Conversations about restructuring investments. Conversations where Vanessa had spoken confidently about decisions that no one had actually confirmed. Edward used to say that truth arrives quietly. It does not crash into a room. It simply waits until someone notices it standing there. Vanessa suddenly straightened her posture again. "Even if that trust exists," she said, her voice regaining a small measure of determination, "Daniel is still the natural successor to the company." Bradley gave a polite nod. "Possibly," he said, "but succession decisions belong entirely to the controlling beneficiary." Daniel slowly turned his head toward me. His eyes looked different now. Not angry, not defensive, just uncertain. The way they used to look when he was young and had realized that a situation was not as simple as he thought. I rested my hands on the table and met his gaze calmly. 2 days earlier, Robert Hale had ended our telephone conversation with a quiet piece of advice that echoed clearly in my mind. "Margaret," he said, "Edward built the company carefully, but he trusted you to protect it." In the bright conference room high above downtown Chicago, with the trust documents lying open on the polished wood table, it was becoming clear that Edward had trusted the right person. Daniel Whitmore kept looking at the document in front of him as though the answer to everything might still appear between the lines if he stared long enough. The silence inside the conference room had changed again, no longer tense, but heavy with the quiet weight of realization. Vanessa sat perfectly still beside him, her posture rigid, her eyes moving back and forth between the trust document and Thomas Bradley. The confident rhythm she carried when we first walked into the office had disappeared completely. In its place was something far more careful. Bradley closed the dark folder slowly and rested both hands on top of it. The master trust was designed to prevent sudden ownership transfers, he explained in the same calm professional tone he had used from the beginning. Edward Whitmore created it so the company could never be redirected without the knowledge of the controlling beneficiary. Daniel rubbed his temple again, then finally looked at me directly. "Mom," he said quietly, "did Dad ever talk to you about this after he got sick?" His question carried the weight of years. For a moment, I watched the sunlight moving slowly across the conference table, remembering a winter afternoon almost 3 years earlier when Edward had first come home from the hospital after the doctors discovered his heart condition. Snow had covered the streets of Evanston that day, and the house felt unusually quiet while he sat in the living room wrapped in a wool blanket. I had brought him tea and sat beside him on the couch. Edward had always been a man who disliked unnecessary drama. Even when the doctor explained the seriousness of his condition, he simply nodded and asked practical questions about treatment schedules and medication. Later that evening, he called me into his study. The room smelled faintly of old paper and cedar shelves where he kept decades of company files. Edward sat behind his desk with a single folder in front of him. "Margaret," he said gently, "I want to go over something with you." I remember thinking at the time that he looked unusually calm, almost peaceful. He opened the folder and slid a document toward me. I recognized the letterhead immediately. Bradley and Hunt Legal Services. "The company structure has a safeguard," he explained. "If anything happens to me, Whitmore Holdings will continue operating normally, but no one will be able to move the foundation beneath it." I asked him why he was telling me this now. Edward smiled slightly and leaned back in his chair. "Because you are the only person who should know where the foundation actually sits." Back in the conference room, Daniel was still watching me carefully. I met his gaze and spoke in the same steady tone Edward always used when discussing business matters. "Your father explained the trust structure once," I said. Vanessa turned toward me sharply. "Once," she repeated. I nodded. "Slowly. Many years ago when the company expanded." Bradley gave a small approving nod. "That matches the timeline of the trust filing," he said. Vanessa leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. The movement looked defensive now rather than confident. "So you knew about this the entire time," she said. I thought about that question for a moment before answering. "I knew Edward believed in building safety nets," I replied calmly. Daniel lowered his eyes again. It was clear he was remembering conversations from the past as well. Edward had always included him in certain discussions about the company, but not all of them. That was another thing Edward believed strongly. Responsibility should be earned slowly. Bradley turned a page in the folder and continued speaking. "The trust does not prevent Daniel or Vanessa from managing operations," he said, "but it ensures that final authority remains with Margaret Whitmore unless she personally appoints a successor." Vanessa leaned forward again, her voice now measured and cautious. "And if she does appoint someone?" Bradley answered without hesitation. "Then that person becomes the next controlling beneficiary under the trust." Daniel looked up again, this time with a different expression. Not confusion. Something closer to humility. "Dad really planned all of this that far ahead?" he asked quietly. Bradley smiled faintly. "Your father was extremely thorough." I allowed the quiet to return again. Outside the office windows, a light cloud moved across the afternoon sun, briefly dimming the bright reflection on the table. For a moment the room felt softer, almost reflective. I thought about the last long conversation Edward and I shared before his condition worsened. We had taken a slow walk along the lakefront trail near our home. The wind coming off Lake Michigan carried that cold, fresh smell it always has in early spring. Edward stopped near a bench overlooking the water and rested his hands on the railing. "Margaret," he said that day, "people assume control belongs to whoever moves fastest. But the strongest structures are built quietly. They do not need to announce themselves." I remember asking him if he was worried about the future of the company. Edward looked out over the gray waves for a moment before answering. "I am not worried about the company," he said. "I am only concerned about who will protect the people inside it." Back in the conference room, Vanessa slowly pushed her chair back an inch and glanced at Daniel. It was the first time since the conversation began that she looked uncertain about what to say next. Daniel remained quiet, studying the trust document again. I rested my hands on the table and looked at both of them calmly. Edward's voice echoed clearly in my memory, steady and thoughtful the way it always had been. "Trust structures," he used to say, "are not designed to punish people. They exist to reveal who truly understands responsibility." And sitting there high above the streets of Chicago, with the quiet city stretching beyond the glass windows, I could see that Edward had not only built a company that would survive him, he had also built a moment that would reveal exactly who was prepared to carry it forward. Vanessa Whitmore finally broke the silence again, but this time her voice carried none of the easy confidence she had brought into the office earlier that afternoon. It sounded measured now, carefully controlled, like someone stepping across unfamiliar ground. "Even if the trust exists," she said slowly, "Whitmore Holdings still needs someone to run it day to day. Margaret cannot manage construction contracts, investment portfolios, and board meetings alone." Thomas Bradley nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a reasonable point. "Operational management is indeed necessary," he said, "which is exactly what the documents signed today allow." Margaret Whitmore has the authority to appoint operational managers while maintaining final control. Vanessa looked toward Daniel, clearly expecting him to respond. Daniel hesitated before speaking. So we still run the company, he said cautiously, but Mom makes the final decisions. Bradley gave a small confirming nod. That is correct. The words settled across the room like a quiet shift in gravity. Earlier that afternoon, Vanessa had believed the company was about to pass completely into her hands and Daniel's. Now the structure looked very different. Daniel leaned forward slowly and studied the trust document again, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. Dad never mentioned this structure to me, he said after a moment. Bradley responded with the calm tone of someone who had reviewed many such cases. Your father believed certain safeguards worked best when fewer people were aware of them, he said. I watched Daniel absorb that idea quietly. When he was younger, Edward often said that Daniel had a good heart, but an impatient mind. Responsibility would come to him, Edward believed, but only after he learned to pause before assuming he understood everything. Vanessa sat very still beside him. Her eyes moved briefly toward me before returning to Bradley. If Margaret is the controlling beneficiary, she said carefully, then technically she can appoint anyone she wants to manage the company. Bradley nodded once again. Yes. Vanessa tapped her fingers lightly against the edge of the table as if organizing her thoughts. Including Daniel, she added. The room fell quiet again. The sound of traffic 22 floors below drifted faintly through the glass windows. I could see Daniel thinking through the situation, slowly adjusting his expectations to match the reality now sitting on the table in front of him. Edward used to say that moments like this revealed more about people than years of comfortable success. It is easy to act confident when everything unfolds exactly as expected. It is much harder to remain steady when the structure changes beneath your feet. Bradley closed the dark folder and placed it neatly beside the signed documents. Ultimately, the decision belongs to Margaret Whitmore, he said, turning slightly toward me. Daniel followed his gaze. Vanessa did as well, though the movement seemed slower now. For a moment, none of them spoke. I rested my hands calmly on the table and looked at my son. The boy who once built wooden boats in our garage was sitting across from me now as a grown man, running a construction firm his father spent 35 years building. I thought about another conversation Edward and I had several months before his passing. It was late evening, and the two of us were sitting in the quiet living room after dinner. The television was off, and the house had that peaceful silence that only arrives when a long day is ending. Edward had been reviewing company reports when he suddenly set the papers aside. Margaret, he said thoughtfully, one day Daniel will lead Whitmore Holdings. I believe that. I asked him why he sounded uncertain. Edward smiled slightly and shook his head. I am not uncertain about Daniel, he replied. I am uncertain about the people who will influence him. Back in the conference room, I looked briefly at Vanessa. She met my gaze with a composed expression, but the confidence from earlier had not returned. The moment stretched quietly. Finally, Daniel spoke again. Mom, he said, I know today has been confusing, but Vanessa and I have been managing the company for almost 2 years now. The board trusts us. The employees trust us. I think Dad would want continuity. His voice carried sincerity. I believe that. Daniel had always cared about the company even when he struggled to understand its deeper structure. Bradley watched the exchange silently, allowing the conversation to unfold without interference. Vanessa leaned forward slightly again. Daniel has done excellent work, she added. The company has expanded into 3 new commercial development contracts this year alone. I nodded slowly. Those numbers were familiar to me. I had read every quarterly report Whitmore Holdings produced since Edward first founded the firm. Another quiet truth Edward often repeated returned to my mind. Real leadership is not proven through titles. It is revealed through patience. I folded my hands together again and spoke in the same calm tone I had used throughout the afternoon. Whitmore Holdings will continue exactly as it has for the past 2 years, I said. Daniel exhaled softly, the tension leaving his shoulders almost immediately. Vanessa's posture relaxed slightly as well, though she remained attentive. Bradley gave a small approving nod as if recognizing a practical resolution. But I was not finished speaking yet. I looked directly at Daniel before continuing. You will remain Chief Operating Manager, I said. The board structure will stay the same. The projects currently under contract will continue without interruption. Daniel nodded quickly. That makes sense, he said. Vanessa allowed herself the faintest return of her earlier smile. But then I added the final sentence. However, I said gently, the trust structure remains exactly as your father designed it. Daniel's expression shifted slightly, not with disappointment, but with understanding. Vanessa's smile faded again. Bradley remained completely still, waiting. I continued in the same calm voice. Final authority over Whitmore Holdings will remain with me. The quiet that followed felt very different from the tension earlier that afternoon. This silence carried clarity rather than confusion. Edward once told me that the strongest decisions are rarely dramatic. They simply place every piece of the structure back where it was always meant to be. And as the sunlight returned across the polished table inside the quiet conference room high above Chicago, it was clear that Whitmore Holdings had just been placed exactly where Edward intended it to stand all along. Daniel nodded slowly after my final words settled across the conference table, and for the first time since we walked into the law office that afternoon, he seemed to accept the structure exactly as it stood. The tension that had been quietly building in the room for nearly an hour finally began to soften. Outside the tall windows, the late afternoon light over Chicago had turned warmer, casting long reflections across the glass buildings in the distance. Thomas Bradley gathered the documents neatly into two separate folders, placing the signed operational papers beside the trust documents with the kind of careful order that comes from decades of legal practice. Then the structure remains exactly as Mr. Whitmore designed it, he said calmly. Daniel continues operating management. Margaret Whitmore retains controlling authority. Vanessa did not respond immediately. She sat perfectly still, her eyes resting on the polished surface of the table, as if she were recalculating something quietly in her mind. I had watched Vanessa long enough over the past several years to recognize that expression. She was someone who liked control. She liked plans that moved quickly and efficiently. Edward used to say that fast plans can build impressive results, but they can also overlook the deeper foundations holding everything together. Daniel finally cleared his throat gently. Mom, he said, his voice softer now, I know today probably felt strange for you. Vanessa and I never intended to make it seem like we were pushing you aside. I looked at my son carefully. Daniel had always struggled to see the difference between intention and impact. It was not cruelty that caused most misunderstandings in families. More often it was simple assumption. I know you believed you were helping, I said calmly. Vanessa lifted her gaze then, watching me closely. Whitmore Holdings has grown quickly these past 2 years, she added. We expanded into new development projects, negotiated several major commercial contracts, and strengthened the investment side of the company. Her tone carried a hint of determination again, as if she wanted to remind the room that their leadership had produced real results. Bradley nodded politely. The growth numbers are impressive, he said. Daniel straightened slightly in his chair, encouraged by the acknowledgement. We wanted to protect the company from uncertainty, he explained. After Dad passed away, things felt unstable for a while. We thought the best approach was to centralize decision-making. Edward's voice returned quietly in my memory once again. During the early years of the company, he often repeated the same idea while reviewing new construction bids at the kitchen table. Strong companies grow through steady leadership, not sudden control. I looked from Daniel to Vanessa and then back at the trust document resting beside Bradley's folder. Your father believed stability comes from structure, I said, not from speed. The room remained quiet for a moment while those words settled in. Vanessa tapped her finger lightly against the arm of her chair, a small, thoughtful rhythm replacing the earlier tension. Daniel leaned forward again, resting his hands on the table. So where do we go from here? He asked. It was a simple question, but it carried the weight of the entire afternoon. Bradley looked toward me briefly before answering. Operationally, nothing changes, he said. Whitmore Holdings continues running exactly as it has. Contracts remain active. Management roles remain the same. The trust simply clarifies the final decision structure. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing the explanation. Vanessa watched him carefully, then looked back at me. The confidence that once filled her voice had shifted into something more cautious, but also more respectful. Margaret, she said, if the trust structure gives you final authority, then the board will expect your guidance on future expansion plans. I noticed the difference immediately. Earlier she spoke as though decisions had already been made. Now she spoke as though she was inviting participation. Edward used to say that leadership often begins the moment people realize they must start listening. I folded my hands again and looked toward the skyline beyond the window before answering. The buildings along the river reflected the fading sunlight in long golden lines. Chicago had always been a city built by people who understood patience. Steel frameworks rise slowly before the skyline changes. Whitmore Holdings will continue growing, I said. But growth must match the strength of the foundation beneath it. Daniel nodded again, more confidently now. We can review the expansion proposals with you, he said. Vanessa gave a small agreeing nod as well. Bradley closed both folders and stacked them together neatly. If there are no additional questions, he said, my office will finalize today's documentation and update the company records to reflect the confirmed trust structure. Daniel stood up, slowly from his chair, stretching slightly after the long meeting. Vanessa followed a moment later, though her expression remained thoughtful rather than celebratory. I stood as well, resting one hand lightly on the back of the chair for balance. Bradley extended his hand politely toward me. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, your husband built a very resilient structure. I smiled faintly. Edward believed in building things that last, I replied. Bradley nodded with quiet understanding. As we prepared to leave the conference room, Daniel paused near the window and looked out over the city for a moment. Dad always said Chicago teaches people how to build, he said softly. Vanessa stepped beside him and followed his gaze across the skyline. For the first time since the meeting began, neither of them seemed focused on control or authority. They were simply looking at the city that held the company Edward had spent his life creating. I watched them quietly, remembering another evening many years earlier when Edward and I stood in almost the same place after signing our very first commercial construction contract. The skyline looked different then, smaller somehow, but Edward's expression had carried the same calm certainty I felt now. Margaret, he told me that night, a strong structure does not collapse when pressure arrives. It simply reveals which beams were holding everything together all along. And as the three of us stepped out of the conference room together while the golden evening light stretched across downtown Chicago, it became clear that Edward Whitmore had designed Whitmore Holdings not only to survive his absence, but also to reveal exactly where its true foundation had always been. We stepped out of the conference room together, and for a moment none of us spoke while the quiet hallway of Bradley and Hunt Law offices stretched out ahead of us. The thick carpet softened the sound of our footsteps as we moved toward the elevators. Late afternoon light poured through the tall windows at the end of the corridor, and the skyline of Chicago glowed in that warm amber color that always appears just before sunset. Daniel walked slightly ahead of me, his shoulders relaxed now, but his posture thoughtful. Vanessa walked beside him, her heels tapping softly against the floor, though her pace was slower than it had been when we first arrived earlier that day. The elevator doors opened with a quiet chime, and the three of us stepped inside. The polished metal walls reflected our silhouettes as the elevator began its slow descent from the 22nd floor. For several seconds, the only sound was the soft hum of the cables above us. Daniel finally broke the silence. Mom, he said gently, I know today probably changed a lot of assumptions. I looked at his reflection in the metal panel beside the elevator door. Sometimes assumptions change because they were never fully understood, I replied calmly. Vanessa folded her arms loosely as she leaned against the wall of the elevator. She did not appear angry anymore. Instead, she seemed focused, like someone reevaluating a complicated map. Edward built more layers into that company than anyone realized, she said quietly. Daniel nodded slightly. Dad was always thinking 10 steps ahead, he said. I remembered the countless evenings when Edward sat at our kitchen table, surrounded by project drawings and legal files, quietly shaping the future of Whitmore Holdings one careful decision at a time. Edward did not rush when he built something important. That patience had defined everything he touched. The elevator reached the lobby, and the doors opened onto the bright marble floor of the building entrance. Outside the glass doors, the evening traffic had begun filling the streets as office workers headed home. Daniel held the door open for me as we stepped outside onto the sidewalk. The air carried the familiar cool breeze that drifted through downtown Chicago in the early evening. We paused for a moment near the curb where a line of taxis waited beneath the tall buildings. Daniel looked toward the river where the water reflected the fading sunlight in long, shimmering lines. I should probably schedule a board meeting, he said thoughtfully. If the trust structure becomes public knowledge inside the company, people will want clarity. I nodded once. Transparency builds stability, I said. Vanessa looked at me carefully as though measuring something new in the conversation. Margaret, she said, I want you to know that Daniel and I truly believe transferring full authority would simplify things for you. I met her gaze calmly. I understand what you believed, I replied. Vanessa hesitated for a moment before continuing. Whitmore Holdings has been moving very quickly these past 2 years. Sometimes when growth accelerates, you start focusing only on the next step. Edward once explained. That rapid growth can create a kind of tunnel vision inside organizations. People become so focused on expansion that they stop noticing the deeper systems holding everything in place. Daniel turned toward me again. Mom, you still want the company to grow though, right? He asked. I smiled faintly. Your father did not build Whitmore Holdings to stand still, I said. But he did build it to last. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing the balance between those two ideas. A taxi driver stepped forward slightly and gestured politely toward his car, but Daniel waved him off with a small smile. We were not in a hurry to leave yet. The three of us stood quietly on the sidewalk watching the evening city move around us. A few minutes passed before Vanessa spoke again. There is something else we should discuss soon, she said thoughtfully. Daniel looked at her. What do you mean? Vanessa glanced briefly toward me before answering. If Margaret holds final authority through the trust, the board will want to know how future succession will work. The word succession lingered in the air. Edward and I had spoken about that subject many times during his final year. Daniel waited for my response, but I remained quiet for a moment. The sound of traffic and distant conversations drifted across the street while the golden light of sunset faded slowly behind the buildings. Finally I spoke. Succession is not decided in a single afternoon, I said calmly. Daniel nodded, understanding the weight of that answer. Vanessa did not argue. Instead, she simply observed me thoughtfully, as if recognizing that the structure Edward created had deeper layers than either of them previously realized. Edward once told me that the purpose of a strong foundation is not only to hold a structure upright, but also to test the patience of the people who hope to lead it someday. Daniel checked his watch and exhaled softly. I should get back to the office, he said. We have a contractor meeting at 7. I placed my hand gently on his arm for a moment. Then go lead your meeting, I said. Whitmore Holdings is still your responsibility to run. Daniel smiled slightly at that and nodded. Vanessa stepped toward the curb and signaled for a taxi. As the car pulled up, Daniel opened the door for me first before sliding into the seat beside me. Vanessa entered on the other side. The taxi pulled away from the curb and joined the slow flow of evening traffic moving along the river. Through the window, I watched the city lights begin to appear one by one across the skyline. Edward loved this hour of the day. He used to say that a city reveals its true character in the quiet moments between daylight and darkness. Daniel leaned forward slightly in the seat. Mom, he said softly, I am glad Dad trusted you with the foundation. I looked out at the glowing buildings reflected in the river and allowed myself a small smile. Edward Whitmore had built many structures in his lifetime, but the strongest one was never made of steel or concrete. It was made of patience, foresight, and the quiet understanding that leadership reveals itself not in moments of control, but in moments of clarity. And as the taxi carried us slowly through the golden evening streets of Chicago, I could feel that clarity settling quietly over the future of Whitmore Holdings. The taxi moved slowly through the evening traffic along Wacker Drive, and the city lights of Chicago reflected across the dark surface of the river like scattered gold. For a while none of us spoke. Daniel watched the buildings pass outside his window while Vanessa sat beside him quietly, her expression thoughtful rather than tense. The rhythm of the city had always helped me think clearly. Edward often said Chicago was a place where strong ideas were tested every single day. If something was built poorly, the city would expose it quickly. But if something was built well, it could stand for generations. Daniel finally turned slightly toward me in the back seat. Mom, he said, when Dad set up the trust 20 years ago, did he ever explain why he chose you instead of putting the company directly under a board structure? I looked out the window for a moment before answering. The taxi passed beneath the steel framework of a bridge, and the sound of tires briefly echoed against the metal above us. Your father believed leadership should stay connected to responsibility, I said calmly. He trusted boards to advise. But he believed one person should always carry the final obligation. Daniel nodded slowly as if that explanation made sense to him now in a way it had not earlier. Vanessa shifted slightly in her seat and glanced toward me. That kind of structure places a lot of weight on one person, she said carefully, especially when the company grows as large as Whitmore Holdings has become. Edward once told me that weight is not always something to avoid. Sometimes weight is what keeps a structure from drifting in the wrong direction. Responsibility always carries weight, I replied gently. The taxi turned onto Michigan Avenue, and the bright lights of storefronts stretched along the sidewalks. Pedestrians moved past restaurant windows while the early evening crowd filled the downtown streets. Daniel leaned forward slightly and rested his arms on the back of the front seat. The board will definitely ask about the trust during the next meeting, he said. Some of the directors have been with the company since Dad's early years. They will probably respect his reasoning, but they will still want clarity about how decisions will be made. I nodded once. Then they should have clarity, I said. Vanessa watched me carefully again. The sharp confidence she once carried had transformed into something more analytical now, like someone studying a complicated blueprint rather than trying to control the building site. What kind of clarity are you planning to give them? She asked. I considered the question for a moment. Outside the window, the tall glass tower of the old Tribune building passed slowly by as the taxi moved with traffic. Edward used to say that important decisions should never feel rushed, even when the answer seems obvious. The board will know exactly what the trust structure means, I said. Whitmore Holdings will continue operating under Daniel's leadership day to day, but major decisions will always pass through the foundation Edward built. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Major decisions like acquisitions, property transfers, and investment restructuring, he said. Exactly, I replied. Vanessa tapped her finger lightly against the side of the door, thinking quietly. That also means succession planning will remain open, she said. The word succession returned again, floating gently in the air between us like an unfinished sentence. Edward and I had discussed that subject many times. Not because he doubted Daniel's ability, but because he believed leadership should mature naturally rather than being forced too quickly. Daniel glanced at Vanessa briefly before looking back at me. Mom, he said, do you already have an idea about the future of the company? The taxi slowed as traffic gathered near a stoplight. Outside the windshield, the red signal reflected softly against the pavement. I remembered standing beside Edward years earlier at the construction site of one of Whitmore Holdings' earliest office towers. The steel beams had only just begun rising above the ground, and the entire structure looked fragile compared to the finished buildings around it. Edward stood quietly watching the workers bolt the framework together piece by piece. Margaret, he said that afternoon, people often think the top floor is the most important part of a building, but the truth is the strength always begins underground. I turned slightly toward Daniel now and answered his question. The future of Whitmore Holdings will grow exactly the way your father intended, I said calmly. One careful decision at a time. Daniel seemed satisfied with that answer. Vanessa remained quiet, but her expression suggested she was considering every word carefully. The taxi moved forward again as the light turned green. The city around us glowed brighter now as night settled over downtown Chicago. Office towers illuminated their upper floors while reflections of moving headlights stretched across the river. After several minutes, Daniel spoke again, his voice thoughtful rather than impatient. I guess today showed us something important, he said. What did it show you? I asked. Daniel looked out the window for a moment before answering. That Dad never built Whitmore Holdings just as a company, he said slowly. He built it as a structure that could protect itself. I smiled faintly. Edward would have appreciated that observation. Vanessa finally nodded once as well. It also showed us something else, she added quietly. Daniel looked toward her. What? Vanessa's voice remained calm when she answered. That Margaret was always part of the foundation, whether we realized it or not. The taxi turned onto a quieter street where the traffic thinned and the city lights reflected gently off the glass towers above. I looked out across the skyline one more time and thought about everything Edward had built during his lifetime. Whitmore Holdings had started as a small family construction firm and grown into a company known across the city for reliability and careful planning. But Edward's greatest design was not a building or a contract. It was the structure of trust he quietly created long before anyone thought to question it. And as the taxi continued moving through the glowing streets of Chicago while the night settled softly across the skyline, I realized that the foundation Edward built was not only protecting the company he loved. It was also revealing who among us truly understood how to carry that responsibility forward. The taxi finally slowed to a stop in front of the Whitmore Holdings headquarters, a tall glass and steel building that Edward had insisted on designing with the same philosophy he used for every structure the company built: strength first, elegance second. The driver pulled to the curb, and Daniel paid the fare while Vanessa and I stepped out onto the sidewalk. The evening air had grown cooler, and the lights from the upper floors of the building shone down onto the street like steady beacons. Employees were still working inside, silhouettes moving behind the illuminated windows as another long business day continued. Daniel looked up at the building for a moment before speaking. "Dad would have liked tonight," he said quietly. I followed his gaze toward the upper floors where the executive offices overlooked the river. Edward used to stand near those same windows late in the evening, studying the city as if every building across the skyline carried a lesson about patience and endurance. "Your father always believed the company should outlive him," I said calmly. Vanessa closed the taxi door behind us and stepped closer to the entrance. Her posture was composed again, but it carried a different kind of awareness now. The confidence she once displayed earlier in the day had evolved into something steadier, something that understood the deeper structure beneath the company's success. "He succeeded," she said softly while looking up at the tower. Daniel nodded once before pushing open the glass doors. The lobby lights reflected across the polished marble floor as we entered the building. A security guard at the front desk greeted Daniel with a respectful nod, clearly accustomed to seeing him arrive at unusual hours during busy project seasons. Daniel returned the greeting and gestured toward the elevators. "The boardroom is still open upstairs," he said. "If we are going to explain the trust structure soon, we should probably review the company reports together first." Vanessa agreed quietly. I followed them toward the elevator as the doors opened with a soft chime. The ride upward felt calmer than the earlier descent from the law office. The tension of uncertainty had faded, replaced by a quiet sense of direction. Edward often said the most important moments in leadership happen after the argument ends and the real work begins. When the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, the hallway lights were dimmer than usual, and only a few offices remained occupied. Daniel led us into the boardroom, where the long oak conference table stretched beneath a row of ceiling lights. City lights shimmered through the wide windows behind the chairs. Daniel placed a stack of quarterly reports onto the table and opened one of the folders. Vanessa took a seat across from him, while I sat near the end of the table where Edward once preferred to review company plans. Daniel flipped through several pages before speaking again. "These are the projections for the next 2 years," he explained. 3 new commercial developments, 2 infrastructure partnerships, and a residential expansion along the north side. Vanessa leaned forward and pointed to one of the charts. "The market is strong right now," she said. "If we move carefully, Whitmore Holdings could become one of the largest construction and development firms in the region." I listened quietly while they discussed the details. Their ideas were ambitious but thoughtful, and I could see the effort they had invested in growing the company since Edward's passing. Daniel finally looked toward me again. "Mom," he said, "you have seen this company from the beginning. Do these plans match the kind of future Dad would have wanted?" I studied the charts for a moment before answering. Outside the windows, the city skyline glowed with the steady light of hundreds of buildings, each one standing because someone once designed a foundation strong enough to hold it upright. Edward used to compare companies to cities. Every structure must support the one beside it. "Your plans are strong," I said calmly. "But remember what your father always taught us. Growth is not measured only by how high a structure rises. It is measured by how long it stands." Daniel nodded thoughtfully while Vanessa closed the folder and rested her hands on the table. For a moment the room fell quiet again, the kind of quiet that signals understanding rather than uncertainty. Vanessa spoke first. "Margaret," she said, Earlier today, you said succession would not be decided in a single afternoon. I met her gaze. That is correct. Daniel looked between us. But one day it will need to be decided, he added carefully. Edward and I had spoken about that moment many times during our final years together. He believed succession should never feel like a sudden announcement. It should feel like a natural step that everyone recognizes when the time arrives. I placed my hands gently on the table and looked at both of them. Whitmore Holdings will continue under the structure your father built, I said. Daniel will lead operations, the board will guide strategy, and the trust will protect the foundation until the right moment arrives. Vanessa nodded slowly as if she understood exactly what that meant. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair and looked once more toward the skyline outside the window. The city lights reflected across the glass like quiet stars scattered above the river. Dad built something incredible, he said softly. I smiled faintly. He built it with patience, I replied. The room grew quiet again while the distant sound of traffic moved through the streets below. Edward Whitmore once told me that the strength of any structure reveals itself not during the day it is built, but during the years that follow. Buildings face wind, rain, and time. Companies face ambition, change, and uncertainty. Only the strongest foundations survive them all. As I looked across the boardroom table at Daniel and Vanessa while the lights of Chicago shone steadily beyond the windows, I realized that Edward's greatest achievement was not simply creating Whitmore Holdings. It was designing a foundation strong enough to guide the people who would one day inherit it. And in that quiet moment high above the city he loved, it was clear that the structure he built was still standing exactly the way he intended.